Happy Thanksgiving, all, and welcome to the Home We Build, where we aspire to be a movement of men who build their lives on a firm foundation. This week on the podcast, we have Helms and Heritage, Outpost Insights, and then we're going to deviate from our series on intentionality. And I just want to share a bit about what I'm thankful for this Thanksgiving. Let's get going. The Home We Build. This week is going to be a little bit of a shorter episode, but we're going to introduce one new segment here called Helms and Heritage, which I've always felt that understanding the past and history and um, here in the United States, understanding civics and how we interact with our governing authorities and whatnot is very important. So this segment here, Helms and Heritage, is going to be one where I dive into topics on history, and I'm mainly going to be focusing on U.S. history and Western civilization, which oddly enough, I found out recently actually doesn't even get taught in public high schools anymore. And so I feel it's very important to understand how we got to where we are because it tells you something about who we are and the values that we have shared as a culture, as well as um, why we believe what we believe. And so much of our culture stems from the Bible, and so I that's what this segment's going to be about. This week is gonna actually not be quite in that same vein. I mean, it is U.S. history, but probably a little bit of a different topic that I'm going to tackle in Helms and Heritage in the future. But because this week we're going to talk about Thanksgiving and history of Thanksgiving and a little bit about um, why we celebrate it and whatnot. Um, One thing I want to touch on though before diving into that discussion is how history is approached. And in in today's world, we have at schools history being taught from a global view a lot of times, and from a secular perspective, and that inherently is a little problematic. And the reason for that is not because we don't want to have an unbiased view of the past. We want to try to understand history in its context and not put our biases on it, and that I think is what the idea behind trying to teach from a secular point of view is, and that's all good and well, but the problem is that's not it's the secular worldview has its own biases, and when you take it to an extreme, and so I'll give an example of why I think it's important to um, approach history from a little bit different than what you might find in a classroom is if you look at like the history of say Iran, for instance. I don't know much about their history, but it would be really, really foolish, and I think most people would agree, to remove the impact that Islam has had on the country of Iran and try to report it as though Islam is untrue and doesn't exist. It not that I believe it is, but if you remove that entirely from the history of Iran, understanding the motives and why decisions were made for what they are becomes very difficult. And so the same applies here in the United States is our country, whether people like to hear it or not, was founded on Protestant Christian values. And the founding fathers very, very regularly professed their faith and a lot of the colonies were founded very specifically by people who were fleeing religious persecution, and trying to find religious freedom and the ability to express their Protestant faith without the hindrance of government. And so taking that out of our history makes understanding the decisions that were made during the revolution and during the Civil War um and throughout our history makes a lot of our those decisions not make the best of sense. Um and beyond that, then when we do eventually get into a little bit more like Western history, Western civilization history, um, we'll see things like um, we'll be able to trace Christianity and how it's that thread of Christianity has woven its way through history and such, and why Western civilization developed the way it did as a result of Christianity in general. So I want to just set that forth a little bit as my perspective on how I view history and how I want to approach these topics as we go forward. So I already actually touched on it a little bit, but I want to jump into um, Thanksgiving and the history of that and where it comes from. And so I already touched on it a little bit, but I want to jump into Thanksgiving and the history of it and why it is we celebrate Thanksgiving and give a little bit of context to that. I thought it'd be appropriate considering this week. And so a lot of people do still know the story of the Pilgrims. A little bit of history on them is that they were what we call the Puritans, and um, they wanted to be able to express their religious beliefs. Let me back up a step. During the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant Church specifically broke off from the Roman Catholic Church for a variety of reasons. Some of it had to do with some of the there were a lot of reasons, but some of it had to do with the amount of tradition that had been built up in the Catholic Church, and some of it isn't expressly taught in the Bible, and um, part of the catalyst for some of these things are translations of the Bible into languages that allowed other people to be able to read it, and so you eventually um, the King of England broke off from the Roman Catholic Church and created the Church of England, which we know as the Anglican Church, and has traced its way through history to the Puritans felt that the Anglican Church still retained too much of some of these um, rituals and some of these um, practices that weren't necessarily all spelled out in the Bible, and so they wanted to be able to have their own church and not have to be um, expressing their beliefs only through the form of the Anglican Church. And um, there's a lot of history around that, but I don't have all the details on that for today. Um, so when they left England, they actually didn't come to the United States right away. They went to Holland first, or the Netherlands, and were there for a few years, but they were English, and they didn't want ended up realizing that they didn't want to they had some of those freedoms that they were looking for, but they didn't want to raise their children as in all the Holland traditions, and customs, and so, um, they at that point, um left Holland and moved and sailed to the New World on 2 ships. One we know is all know is the Mayflower, and this was in 1620. The other one was called the Speedwell, and about halfway, well, maybe not probably not halfway, but as they were going, the Speedwell was having a lot of um, leaks and challenges, and so they were forced to the Speedwell was forced to turn back, and all the settlers that were going to the New World boarded the Mayflower, and so we had they were there was a lot more, and it caused the trip to go a lot take a lot longer. So after the lengthy trip, the Pilgrims landed in Cape Cod, which is the little hook part of Massachusetts, um, in November of 1620, which November is not really when you'd want to be landing to start forming a colony, especially in New England. Their winters up there are very obviously very challenging and bitter cold, and so landing there right on the cusp of winter left them in a very um, vulnerable position to be able to um, actually set up a settlement and to start. Like, they didn't have the time to gather food and so and throughout that course of that first winter, only about half of the 100 and so pilgrims that actually made their way across the ocean actually survived. So they were down to 50 or so people. Um, and so that Thanksgiving that following year would end up being a celebration of survival. But I want to before I get to that, I want to add a little bit of color around how we can see in this even in these first instances in colonies that where we ended up at how we ended up at the American Revolution and the founding of America. And so I want to explain one or two other things about the crossing. And so the Pilgrims, when they left Holland for the New World, were they had made they weren't all Puritans. So some of it was Puritans, and that those were the people who had worked with the crown and made an agreement with the crown to set up a colony in the Virginia area. But some of the people who were on the Mayflower were not the Puritans. Some of them were and if you look back on history, they're actually called the strangers. And so, but these were people who had a had skill sets that the Puritans didn't. So some of them were fishermen, some of them were um, had skill in carpentry work and building, and people who had skills that were going to be very very critical to making building a settlement. And so as they arrived, these strangers knew that they had been given permission to set up a colony in Virginia. And the the odd thing is they didn't land in Virginia. And so they actually landed in Massachusetts on the tip of Cape Cod. And that is so when that occurred, there was some level of almost um, mutiny that was occurring between the strangers and the Puritans because the Puritans had the rights to go and set up the colony, but the people who weren't Puritans were having some trouble with some of the religious aspects of it. So they set up what is called the Mayflower Compact, and you may have heard. I don't know if they still teach this or not, but um, the Mayflower Compact was this document that was written by and set up by the Pilgrims, namely William Bradford, their leader, who and it's one of the first instances we see of um, kind of some of the ideas around governance. And I'm going to read it because it's not very long. Um, and so here's the Mayflower Compact. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, etc. Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all all due submission and obedience, in witness whereof we have hereunto subscribed our names at Cape Cod the 11th of November in the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland the 54th, Anno Domini 1620. And so what we see here is this first instance that even going back all the way to the first colonies and the first people who arrived, some of the first people who arrived in what we now know as America, a document that is we're going to come together as the people and we are going to agree to coalesce as one, and through that we will create laws, and as the people we will govern ourselves and obey the laws that we agree to as the people. And it's so important to see that these ideas that we hold so dearly as the United States didn't just start at 1776 and didn't just start with our founding fathers, but originate with people who were very religious that were seeking deliverance out of some level of religious persecution, and trying to find a way to practice their faith and have freedom in that. And those people who also are what we would consider Christians are the ones that originated these some of these ideas of self-governance um, and freedom within religion and whatnot. And so it's important to see some of how that gets traced all the way through our history, and see how we ended up with the values that we so hold dear today. Um, and so that following year, then after surviving through the first winter, and then having and then starting to set things up in the spring, they ended up working and meeting with the Wampanoag people, the most famous of which is Squanto, who went and helped. He had actually been to England and learned English, so he was actually able to translate for the Pilgrims with their people, and he helped them learn how some of the most efficient methods for farming, how to where to go fishing, and a variety of other things that help them build their colony in the new world. And so that first Thanksgiving um, was a celebration of survival, but also abundance. But going back even further, Thanksgiving days are something that we see in history beyond just here in the United States, and Thanksgiving days in general have a long history. So what we see today is not actually is very different than what we would have seen back in 1621 when the first Thanksgiving occurred. And so when we look back on history, we see even in the Bible, the Jews had a day that they were told by God to celebrate as a day of Thanksgiving. And I want to say it was the festival of Tabernacles. I I could be wrong on that, but I read it was in one of the articles I was reading when I was doing my prep for this, that there's a tradition in the Bible of a celebration of Thanksgiving, and we see that through ancient Greece and a variety of other places as well. And so they were typically celebrations of Thanksgiving surrounding either a bountiful harvest, um, or victory in battle, or it could be rain after a famine, or over. I mean, there could be a lot of reasons why people would celebrate a day of Thanksgiving. And so this first, what the first, some of the first iterations that we see here in the States were surrounding the harvest time, and eventually it got formalized. But um, going back to last week, I think this is such a great instance in which, and demonstration of how God views his people and how that plays itself out. Because if you listen to the podcast last week, we saw that people often get divided left and right, or black and white, or rich and poor. And God doesn't view us that way. God views us all as sinners. we're all fallen equally. We're all fallen human beings, and so the first Thanksgiving is a really great picture of how God's blessings and his bounty in the harvest brought people who normally maybe not get along as well as they could together in celebration, and that they were viewed as equals, and that we all are human beings, and we're all thankful for the blessings that God has. Whether they believe both sides believed it or not is irrelevant, but it's a picture of how God's blessings can bring people together, um, which I think is a really great picture and something to keep in mind as we're going into this Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving kind of started with the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag tribe, but then as the years went by, these colonies continued to celebrate this over and over again, and it became more of a tradition and was a tradition that found its way into other colonies as well. And it wasn't something that was formalized actually until way later in time. But um, one or two other little bits that I thought were interesting about the history of Thanksgiving that I'll share as it got more and more formalized was um, there's three people I'm going to highlight. One was Sarah Josepha Hale, who, funnily enough, I actually hadn't really read much about this individual, but um, she is where we get the poem "Mary Had a Little Lamb," which I thought was very interesting. And so she was at a younger age was widowed and ended up in the marketplace, founding a magazine and used her platform to petition government officials, mainly the governors, and eventually all the way up to President Lincoln in the Civil War to formalize Thanksgiving. And Lincoln's the second one I would um, mention because he's the first president to really kind of declare Thanksgiving. It wasn't formalized as a national holiday day until much later, but he made a proclamation during the Civil War. I believe let's see here, it was um, in 1863 that the fourth Thursday in every November would be Thanksgiving. And to actually formalize a national holiday takes an act of Congress, I believe. So it wasn't a formal holiday, but as a proclamation from the president, it carried some weight and it became a much more foundational tradition that was carried out in the United States eventually. And this was one instance in which I was actually kind of um, I thought was a little humorous is during World War II, FDR, and comes for me goes back to the importance of having traditions and why traditions are important in general. And I'm going to probably talk a bit more about that when we get to Christmas. Um, but FDR in World War II, trying to jumpstart the economy, tried to declare Thanksgiving a week earlier, so it'd be the third Thursday of every November, and so there was about 2 years where Thanksgiving was celebrated on 2 different weeks and by a lot of different people, but the backlash was enough that eventually because more or less his logic was, "If we can extend the season in between Thanksgiving and Christmas, we're gonna be able to jumpstart the economy with more Christmas buying," and which is such a just a secular point of view of some of these things and not valuing that history, which is frustrating to me. But I thought it was humorous that the backlash was enough that he had to relent, and eventually it was in during FDR's um, presidency that Congress ended up formalizing um, Thanksgiving as the fourth day of or fourth Thursday of November. Ultimately, I just thought it would be appropriate to spend some time here this week reflecting on where Thanksgiving comes from and its importance as we go into Thanksgiving tomorrow. On Outpost Insights this week, I just wanted to share a little bit about where Alicia and I are at, and something that's been a little helpful for me this week is I've reflected on some things surrounding gratitude and thankfulness, um, in our current situation in life. And so, Elise and I, obviously, if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that she is pregnant with twins currently, and we've been in this odd phase of life, um, on some level where we we had a life group we were a part of through our church, um, that we actually were leading, and we were leading that through, about January of this year, and then, February came around, and we moved from our two-bedroom apartment to the house that we are in currently, and that has been an enormous blessing. But through that, life got really, really crazy and hectic, and so we had to kinda step back a little bit, and our co-leaders took over the group, and over time, we just realized that group was there wasn't anything wrong with it, but it was becoming more of a burden than it was a blessing, and more of an obligation than it was something that we felt like we were called to. And so in May, roughly, we stepped back from that. And through the course of the summer, obviously, Alicia got pregnant, and we were working through, um, what our next steps were going to be. We're talking about possibly getting into a different life group and testing out some different life groups at the church we were at the time. And as time went on, and it started for me first, we just realized that we ended up wanting to change churches, not because we had been hurt or anything like that, but it didn't feel as though the church we were at was one that was, um, say, pushing us forward in our faith. And so we, I we ended up changing churches. Um, and in the midst of that, I had started this podcast, and had been trying to, um, learn a bit more about how to brand my business. And in the last few weeks, having done this in this podcast in this format now, um, I've just realized that there's been some learnings that I've been taking away from it in terms of, um, I'm learning to communicate, and realizing where my calling at as is in life. And so we are in this, and I texted Alicia this literally like a week or two ago. Is I feel And I was listening to a sermon, I think it was by Pastor Mark Driscoll, out in he has a church out in Phoenix that I listen to on a fairly regular basis, and it struck me that I think we find ourselves in a time of life that is preparing us for something. I don't know what that is. It could just be the arrival of our 2 little girls in January, February. It could be that. It could be something significantly more ministry-wise, or could be something related to my business. I didn't really feel like I got a clear answer on what that looked like, but it felt like God was saying, "This is a time for you to prepare yourself, and this is a time for you to apply yourself, and to improve, and to get ready, because I've got something for you, and I don't know what that is." And so in this time of waiting, because I'm learning I'm learning some new skills, but I'm also, um, spending some time. We're just kind of trying to improve ourselves, and learn, and prepare for what God has in store for us. In that, I don't know when the end of that is, and that is something that is it doesn't make me anxious, but it just it lends a little bit of mystery to life. And so in that waiting period, it has been a blessing to try to be thankful to God. And so in preparing for this, I came across two verses that I'd like to share today. The first is First Thessalonians 5:16 and 18. Um, excuse me, First Thessalonians 5:16 through 18, which says, "Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." Um, and the second verse is Colossians 2:6 through 7, which says, "So then, just as you received Christ Jesus as Lord. Continue to live your lives in Him, rooted and built in Him, strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. And so, as I've been going into this Thanksgiving season, I've been thinking about what I'm thankful for, and also reflecting on God's calling for us to be thankful in all circumstances, um, but also to be thankful to Him even in times of waiting, in times of being rooted and built up in Him and strengthened in the faith. And even when it doesn't feel like there is a horizon to look at where I can say, all right, that's where like the next kind of phase of life is going to start. And it's just all I see is that you don't even see the horizon because there's mountains in the way. It's like ultimately it's you're trying to prep for what God has in store without knowing what that is, and in doing so, being thankful for the blessings that is preparing yourself, um and learning and improving and applying yourself. And that is something I've been struggling with a little bit, is trying to be thankful in a situation in which I don't know where we're going. Um, but it's also, I think, very important for us to be thankful to God in everything. And one something that I heard recently this week as I was thinking about this was the idea of thankfulness and gratitude is really an acknowledgement of our dependence on God. It's not just thank you for everything you give me. It's thanking God for something that you give me, acknowledges that I couldn't have gotten it myself. And that has also been something that I've been reflecting on this week, as I've been thinking about what we're looking forward to in Thanksgiving, and the blessings that God gives us. So, lastly, here, um, in the firm foundation is typically my kind of my main segment, but today it's actually taking a back seat to some other things. Um, Today, I just want to express some thank express what it is that I'm thankful for, and maybe this can give some thoughts and of things that might be worth being thankful for in your own life. Um, I am thankful to God for all of this, and ultimately, there are things that He does in our lives that we can't do ourselves, and I'm just thankful for all the blessings He gives us. And so, a couple things that I wanted to highlight, and I'm going to keep this is going to be on the shorter side, but um, obviously, my friends and family, Alicia, my wife, and the coming kids that God has blessed us with, and my siblings and my parents, my mom and dad, and Brandon and Rachel, my siblings, um, all the extended family that I have, whether it be um, Alicia's parents and her brother and sister, in law, or any of her aunts and uncles, or my aunts and uncles and cousins. Um, they've all supported us in so many different ways, especially as we're getting into having children. Like all the blessings God's given us through our baby showers, I've been so thankful for. Um, Friends, I've got a number of buddies that I am very thankful for, between Travis, Seth, Ted, Jacob, and Patrick. These guys have been by my side through a lot of different things, and I've been so appreciative of them. A number of them stood up and were ushers in my wedding. Um, I'm thankful for our church, which is Lake Point Church here in the Dallas area. Pastor Josh, Pastor Mike, Pastor Ryan, all the leaders there that so so well steward the blessings God has given them. I'm thankful for our leaders here in this country, President Trump, Vice President Vance, the military, and what they do to protect us every year and through our history. I'm thankful for the career God has blessed me with. I'm thankful for um, the joys of work and as challenging as it can be sometimes, the um, blessings that come from putting in a hard day's work and knowing that you did what you could for God's kingdom. Um, I'm thankful for the candle business and this podcast and being able to um, learn and grow in some ways and stretch myself in ways that I don't get elsewhere. And and then again, it all comes back to God in this and that. I'm thankful for all of His blessings, but then also um, the sacrifice of His Son on the cross for us, and the willingness of God to put Himself on the line to allow us to spend eternity with Him, and um, being thankful for the fact that He allows us to spend eternity with Him, and that I'm knowing that having accepted that gift of um, that gift of salvation through Christ means that I get to spend eternity with my Creator one day when all is said and done. And so, just some thoughts to be thankful this holiday season, and I just pray um, for anyone and everyone listening to this that you would take some time to reflect on what it means to be thankful and to spend some time with friends and family, celebrating all the blessings that God gives us every day. And with that, God bless. Happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see y'all next week.